Let's start. Imagine you possess a mountain made entirely of silver, not a metaphorical mountain, a literal, physical peak of pure ore towering 15,000 feet into the sky. Every single day, thousands of men hollow it out, load the chunks onto massive wooden ships, and sail it directly to your front door. You control 60% of the world's silver supply. You are Philip II of Spain. You rule an empire so massive that the sun physically never sets on your territory, stretching from the Philippines across the Americas and deep into the heart of Europe. And yet, in the year 1557, you sit at your desk in the Escorial Palace, pick up a quill, and write a letter to your bankers admitting something impossible. You are completely, utterly broke. You have no money to pay your soldiers. You have no money to buy food for your fleets. You are declaring sovereign bankruptcy. And you aren't just going to do this once. You are going to go bankrupt in 1557, and then again in 1560, and then again in 1575, and then one final time in 1596. In fact, the Spanish crown will default on its national debts 9 separate times over the coming century. How does the richest human being on earth run out of money? Because extreme wealth does not create financial stability. When it arrives too quickly, without effort, it creates an economic sickness. A sickness that slowly rots a country from the inside out until nothing is left but the illusion of power. To see how an empire drowns in its own money, we have to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to the Viceroyalty of Peru, to a place the Spanish called Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. Located in modern-day Bolivia, Potosi was a frozen, jagged wasteland, sitting 3 miles above sea level. The air was so thin that Spanish horses regularly died just from breathing it. But inside this barren rock was the largest deposit of silver in the history of the planet. Between 1545 and 1650, an estimated 40,000 tons of silver were ripped out of this single mountain. The Spanish forced the indigenous population into a brutal, lethal labor system called the mita. Under this law, local villages were required to supply a massive quota of men every single year to work the mines. Fathers would intentionally cripple their own sons, breaking their legs, just to save them from being drafted into the labor force. They knew the mountain was a death sentence. Men were sent into the freezing, pitch-black tunnels for 6 days at a time, breathing in toxic silica dust and mercury vapors. The death toll was catastrophic. It was a human sacrifice on an industrial scale, designed purely to feed the global demand for shiny metal. The mountain literally consumed human lives and spat out silver coins. But for Philip II, sitting an ocean away in Madrid, Potosi was a magical, endless ATM. Twice a year, heavily armed fleets called the Spanish Treasure Armadas would arrive in the port city of Seville. They unloaded stacks of silver bars so heavy that the wooden docks groaned under the weight. In a normal economy, producing goods takes time, labor, and innovation. A country has to farm wheat, weave textiles, and forge tools to create real value. But Spain didn't have to produce anything. They just dug up money from the dirt. At first, this felt like an absolute economic miracle. Philip wanted to build massive palatial estates. He built them. He wanted to fund the Holy League to fight the Ottoman Empire at the staggering Battle of Lepanto. He funded it. When he decided to launch the massive Spanish Armada to invade England in 1588, he spent over 10 million ducats outfitting 130 massive galleons. He paid for it all in hard silver. But slowly, invisible cracks began to form in the foundation of the Spanish economy. It started in the bustling markets of Seville. A merchant selling a simple loaf of bread noticed that suddenly there were dozens of Spanish nobles walking around with massive bags of silver coins. Everyone was suddenly rich. So, the merchant realized he could charge 2 silver coins for the bread instead of 1. Then he charged 4, then 10. This phenomenon was the birth of the price revolution. Over the course of the 16th century, the massive influx of silver caused the price of basic goods in Spain to increase by over 400%. We call it inflation today. But to a peasant living in 1560 who didn't understand macroeconomic theory, it just felt like sudden, inexplicable starvation. As prices skyrocketed, a bizarre economic trap snapped shut around the Spanish Empire. Because there was so much silver flowing around, Spanish workers demanded higher wages just to afford basic food. Because Spanish wages were so incredibly high, it became impossibly expensive to manufacture anything inside Spain. Why pay a Spanish weaver a fortune to make a simple wool coat when you could buy a much cheaper coat imported from France or the Netherlands? Slowly but surely, Spain stopped making things. The domestic textile mills shut down. The farms were abandoned because it was easier to import cheap wheat from the Baltic states. Spain was transforming from a highly productive economy into a nation of absolute consumers, buying everything from foreign countries, using their mountain of silver. But Philip II had a massive logistical problem. The silver fleets only arrived in Seville twice a year, and wars do not pause to wait for a boat. Philip needed cash immediately. every single day to pay his massive armies spread across the European continent. So he turned to a small group of highly sophisticated men operating out of the Italian city-state of Genoa, the Genoese bankers. These men, from elite families like the Centurioni and the Grimaldi, controlled the financial arteries of Europe. They didn't move physical gold around. They used complex networks of paper credit called bills of exchange. Philip would sign short-term loan contracts with them called assientos. The Genoese would guarantee that Philip's generals in Flanders would receive gold on the front lines tomorrow. In exchange, Philip promised to pay the Genoese back with massive interest when the next treasure fleet arrived from Potosi. It was the ultimate payday loan scheme, operating on a terrifying geopolitical scale. Philip was borrowing heavily against money that hadn't even been dug out of the ground yet. By 1575, Philip's total debt had ballooned to an astronomical 37 million ducats. His annual government revenue was only 5 million. The math was no longer functioning. Every single bar of silver that arrived in Seville was already legally owned by a Genoese banker before it even came off the ship. And so, on September the 1st, 1575, Philip II executed a financial maneuver that shook the world. He issued a formal decree of suspension. He essentially looked at the most powerful bankers in the world and said, "I am the king, and I am simply not going to pay you." He forcefully converted all of their high-interest, short-term debt into low-interest, perpetual long-term bonds called juros. It was a brutal, unilateral default. Philip thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought he had wiped his slate clean and reasserted sovereign dominance. But the Genoese bankers did not panic. They retaliated with terrifying precision. They completely cut off Philip's access to global credit. They refused to transfer a single coin or honor a single bill of exchange for the Spanish armies fighting the brutal Dutch revolt. For months, tens of thousands of heavily armed Spanish soldiers sat in the freezing mud of Flanders, watching their paychecks bounce. Hunger set in, then anger, then absolute chaos. In November 1576, the darkest moment of the crisis arrived. The unpaid, starving Spanish army completely snapped. They mutinied against their own empire and marched on the wealthy, loyal merchant city of Antwerp. Over 3 days of horrific, unhinged violence known as the Spanish Fury, the unpaid soldiers burned Antwerp to the ground. They slaughtered 7,000 innocent civilians in the streets. They looted the equivalent of millions of dollars in wealth just to pay their own back wages. The destruction of Antwerp permanently crippled one of the most important financial hubs in Europe. Philip's arrogant attempt to fix his crisis had literally burned his own empire's economic engine to ash. So why did the Genoese bankers ever lend to him again? If a man defaults on you in 1557, and again in 1560, and again in 1575, why would you give him a single ducat more? Because the Genoese were running a calculated, cold-blooded mathematical formula. They knew Philip would eventually default. It was completely priced into their models. The interest rates they charged on the Assiento loans were so aggressively high, sometimes reaching 40%, that as long as Philip paid them for 5 or 6 years before the inevitable default, the bank still made a massive net profit. The bankers were treating the Spanish Empire like a sprawling casino, and they were the house. Philip was just a high-rolling gambler addicted to war, constantly coming back to the table for more chips. The silver of Potosi did not make Spain the permanent master of the world. Instead, it acted like a highly addictive narcotic. It destroyed Spain's domestic industries. It funded endless, pointless wars that drained the working population. When the Spanish Armada sank to the bottom of the ocean in 1588, Philip didn't just lose ships. He lost millions of ducats of borrowed money that he still owed interest on. It trapped the government in a vicious cycle of crushing debt and humiliating bankruptcies. By the time the silver mines finally started to run dry in the 17th century, Spain had nothing left to fall back on. No manufacturing base, no agricultural independence, just a mountain of worthless IOUs and fading memories of glory. Fast forward back to today. Modern economists have a specific, terrifying term for what happened to Philip II. They call it the resource curse, or Dutch disease. It happens when a developing country discovers a massive, lucrative deposit of oil, or diamonds, or rare earth minerals. The sudden influx of foreign money drives up the value of their local currency, making their other exports too expensive for the rest of the world to buy. Their factories close down. Their farms wither and die. The entire nation becomes entirely dependent on pulling one single resource out of the dirt. Look at modern Venezuela, sitting on the absolute largest proven oil reserves on the planet, yet crippled by hyperinflation, food shortages, and total economic collapse. Look at nations across the globe where massive mineral wealth translates directly into extreme poverty for the actual citizens, while a small corrupt elite funnels the profits to foreign bank accounts. The trap that destroyed the mighty Spanish Empire in the 1500s is the exact same trap destroying modern nations right now, because true wealth is not a shiny rock you dig out of the ground. Wealth is the productive capacity, the knowledge, and the labor of a society. When a nation replaces real production with mindless extraction, they aren't building a sustainable economy. They are just digging a very expensive, very deep grave. If you are fascinated by the hidden history of money and the invisible systems that run the world, make sure to subscribe. The tragic story of Philip II is the ultimate proof that money itself has no inherent power to save you. You can control literal mountains of solid silver. You can have massive wooden ships overflowing with treasure arriving at your door every single day. But if you do not understand the fundamental mechanics of debt, inflation, and production, that silver will slowly sink you into the quicksand. Philip II spent his entire life sitting on top of the richest mountain on earth, and he died broke.